Hey there, how's it going everybody? In this video, we're going to be learning how to create graphical user interfaces in Python using Tkinter. And Tkinter is a popular package used for creating GUIs in Python, and it's actually part of the standard library, so there shouldn't be anything additional that we need to install in order to start working with this. Now, there are some other popular packages for creating user interfaces in Python, and we'll take a look at some of those in the future and see why we might choose one over the other. But in this video, we're going to be getting started using Tkinter to create a basic application. But first, let me show you a quick example of something that we can build using Tkinter. So I'm currently working on a personal application here. Let me pull this up. And I built this using Tkinter and some databases in the background. And what this is it's something to help me categorize credit card transactions. And this is just the first version of this, so there's a lot of changes that need to be made. But we can see here that it has everything that you'd expect from a typical GUI application. So we have text input fields here, radio buttons, checkboxes, buttons for saving data. We can even switch menus up here that shows me a list view of all of the categories that I currently have saved and things like that. So that's just a quick overview of something that we can build using Tkinter. And I'll actually do a separate video on writing those other applications from scratch, start to finish. But in this video, I wanted to cover getting started with Tkinter. So we're just going to learn how to create a window, learn about the basics of adding different widgets like buttons, labels, text fields, and other common elements that are used in these types of application. And we'll also learn about the different ways of positioning in order to lay out our widgets within the application exactly how we want. And we'll also learn how to handle events like clicking buttons, pressing on the keyboard, and things like that. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Now, I had mentioned that this is part of the standard library with Python, so there shouldn't be anything that we need to install using pip. But in my case, I'm using Homebrew's version of Python, and it didn't connect everything in the background that needs to be connected. So I actually had to go and install this additional library through Homebrew, and that is brew install python-tk. So even though it is in the standard library and there's nothing additional to install through pip, on my specific system on Mac through Homebrew, I did have to install this one additional package. But now I'm going to go ahead and close that and bring this up. So now let's jump in and start writing our first GUI application. Now, first, let's run a basic test to make sure that everything is working as it should. So to do this, they have this helper function here to where we can just say import Tkinter as tk and then run tk._test. And if we run this, then we can see that we get this pop-up window here, and it gives us the latest version of Tkinter, or it tells us what version we're using, and adds a button here that has some functionality to it, and also a button to quit out of this. Now, I'm going to be starting this tutorial with the assumption that what we did there works for you and that we can get started using Tkinter. Now, if that test doesn't work for you, then there are several things that could be going wrong in the background that are beyond the scope of this video, so that I'm just not going to dive into here. So again, I'm going to start from the assumption that this script works for you so far up to this point. Okay, so now we're ready to get started by writing a simple application. So to do this, we can initialize our main window, and we will call this root. So I'll say root is equal to, and this is just tk.tk. So if I was to run this now, then we don't get any errors or anything like that down here, but nothing actually popped up. Now, something does actually happen here, but it's just opening and closing the application too quickly for us to notice. So in order for us to keep the window open, we have to start the application's main loop. And this is also what allows us to listen for events like mouse clicks and keyboard presses and things like that. So we can start this loop just by saying root.main loop. And if we run this, then we can see that now we get this blank window with nothing in it, which is what we should expect since we haven't added anything to our application yet. So let's go ahead and do that now and add a simple button. But first, one simple addition that every GUI should probably have is a simple title for the window that pops up. So to set this, write under where we're creating our root. We want to do this above where we're starting that main loop. We can just say root.title, and I'll just set this title to simple app. Now, if I run this, then we can see here that we have a title of simple app on our window here now. So that's good. So now let's add some widgets, and we'll start with a button. Now, since Tkinter has evolved over the years, there are a lot of different ways to do things. Now, the goal in this video isn't to see how everything has evolved over time, but to use the current best practices to get up and running. So you may see other tutorials do something differently than how we're doing it here, but that's okay. All I can do is show you the most recent way of how I've learned to do things. And if you do see someone doing it differently in the future, then you can investigate that down the road when you come across it. So let's go ahead and create our button. So to add a button here, I'm just going to say button is equal to tk.button. And now we're going to pass in our root. And we're passing in root here because this is going to be the parent window where our widget will be added. And we don't have any others right now. So let's go ahead and pass in root. And we'll see some examples of some different parent windows here in a little bit. And now let's go ahead and give our button some text as well. So I'll say text is equal to, and we'll just say button 1. And now that this button is created, we can add it to our window. And we can do that using one of the geometry managers to specify how we want to add it to our window. Now, we're mainly going to be using the grid layout in this series of videos, since that seems to be the most flexible with most applications. And it's also the layout mentioned in the Tkinter documentation as the more modern layout system. So to add this button, we can simply call the grid method on the button. Now, you have to do this in order to get the button to show up in our window. It can be an easy mistake to create a widget like we did here and wonder why it's not showing up, only to later realize that we didn't use one of these geometry managers to explicitly add it to our window. So to do this, I'm just going to say button.grid, and that will add it to our window. If I save that and run it, then we can see that now we have a very simple application here with a button that doesn't currently do anything. Now, we're using the grid layout here, and as you can probably guess from the name, we can use this to lay out things in a grid with rows and columns. So let's see what this looks like by adding a label before our button. So to do this, I'm going to close down what we have for now. Above our button here, I'm going to create a new label, and this is going to be tk.label, and again we're going to pass in this root parent here, and then let's go ahead and add some text to this as well. I'll just call this label 1. Now again, I'll show you what this looks like if I don't add this using our grid system. Then we can see that we don't have a label here in our application. So you always have to remember, if you want something added, then we can say label1.grid. It uses that grid layout, and now we have a label here above our button 1. So by default, it's stacking these on top of each other into a single column. Now we can specify exactly how we want these to be laid out by setting the rows and columns. So let me close this. And now where we're adding it to our grid here, let's specifically say that we want this to be in row 0, which this is a 0-based index, so that would be the first row. And we'll also set the column to 0, so the first column as well. And now let's also do this with our button. So instead of row 0, column 0, I'm going to make this column 1. So now that should be in the second column. Now if I run this, then we can see that now we only have a single row here, and the label is in the first column and the button is in the second column. Now, I know that this beginning stuff can be a bit boring, but we just have to build up this small stuff step by step in order to build our larger applications. Okay, so now that we've added a couple of widgets, let's now add in some event handling. So for example, let's say that when our button is clicked, we want it to run a function within Python. So to do this, let's first create a simple function here, and I'll just call this onClick, and it's not going to take any parameters for now, and I'm just going to have it print out testing. And now to add this functionality to our button, we can set the command parameter to this function. So within our button here, when we are creating it, I'm going to set the command equal to this onClick function. Now you want to be sure that you're setting it equal to the function itself and not the executed version of that function. So we do not want the parentheses here. We want to pass this in without running it. So now let's go ahead and run this. And now if I click on our little button over here, then we can see that down in our Python script that it is printing out testing in our console. So that is running that function as we'd expect. Now we can also use these functions to change values within the GUI window itself. So instead of printing something out within our Python terminal, what if instead we wanted to change our label when I clicked on the button? So to do this, instead of printing out testing, all I want to do is I want to say label.config, and we want to config the text of that label, and we'll just say something like button clicked. So now if I save this and run it, make this a little larger here, if I click on our button, then we can see that now our label has changed to button clicked instead of label 1. So that worked. Now there's all kinds of different things that we can change with the configuration of different widgets. If you wanted to see what's available, then you could either look these up online, but for a quick printout, we can simply call the config method within our script and print that out. And this will return a dictionary with keys. So let's go ahead and see what keys are available with this label. So after I create this label down here, I'm just going to print out label.config. And what we want to do here is just grab these keys. So if I save this and I run it, then we can see that we get some dictionary keys back here. So we have active background, active foreground. Where is the text? The text is down here. So that's what we set when we clicked our function. So there's all kinds of things that we can change here. So for any widget, if you want to see the possibilities, then you can just run that there to get a list of all the keys that are available to you. Okay, so now that we have the very basics down, let's make a super simple form where we can have a place to insert text. And we'll have a button that will add that text value to a list, and also a list to hold all those values. So connecting all that together will show us a bit more of how to handle certain events. So to do this, we'll add a couple of widgets that we haven't seen yet, but the process is very similar to what we've already seen. So first, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of everything that we have here so far, all except for our title, root, and main loop. So first, let's keep everything a bit more organized by using a frame. Now, a frame is basically just a container that allows us to hold different widgets and allows us to more easily organize our layout. Let's create one of these now, and then we'll look at why they're useful in just a bit. So to create one, I'm just going to say frame is equal to tk.frame, and now we're going to pass in this root as the parent window. And now we need to add this to our application as well. So I'll just set this equal to row 0 and column 0 like we saw before. Let me fix this typo here. And again, like I said, a frame is just a container for other widgets. So if I was to run this now, then we're not going to see anything. We're not actually adding anything to our window yet. It's just a container. So now that we have this frame added to our root window, now we're actually going to add our widgets to this frame instead of the root window itself. And like I said before, this will allow us to better organize our widgets in more complicated layouts. And we'll see that in action in just a bit. So now let's create a text entry within our frame. So I'm just going to call this entry, and this is going to be equal to text or tk.entry, sorry. And now, instead of passing in root as our parent window, we're going to pass in this frame as our parent window. So now it's going to be included in this frame, and this frame is included in the root application. And this frame is going to have its own layout. So even though we set this frame equal to row 0 and column 0 within the root, we're going to be starting over at 0 when we add widgets to this frame. And if that doesn't make sense now, then I think it'll make sense in just a second when we see how all this comes together. So now that we've added this entry to our frame, we can specify that within that frame, we want it to be on row 0 and column 0 of that frame. So I'm just going to say entry.grid, and we'll say the same thing here, row 0, column 0. Okay, so now we have a text entry added to our frame. And now let's put a button beside this text area that will add text from that field to a list. So to do this, I'm just going to call this entry button. We'll set this equal to tk.button, and the parent window that we want to use is the frame, and the text I'm just going to put as add. And again, we're going to want to add this using the grid layout. So I'm going to say entry button.grid row 0, and instead of column 0, I'll put this in column 1. So now we have our text entry and we have our button. Now let's put a list box below these that will hold all of the values that we add. So to do this, I'm just going to say text underscore list is equal to tk dot, and this will be a list box. And again, we're going to want to pass in that frame as our parent window, and we're not going to add any more arguments there. And for our grid layout on our text list, let's put this on the second row. So that would be row 1 and column 0. So now we've added a couple of things. Let me go ahead and save this and run it really quick. And it looks like I possibly forgot to close down our last application. Sometimes you'll run into that when doing these GUI applications. If you actually accidentally run one and then don't close it down, then it could prevent you from running other ones in the future. So let's make sure that that's closed down. Now I'll rerun it, and we can see here that we have our text entry, our add button, and our text list. So we can see that this isn't the best looking GUI application. It's very basic, and when I resize the window here, it's not responsive when we resize our window, but we'll fix all of that once we get the functionality working. So what we want to be able to do is type something here into this text entry, click on the add button, and have it add it to this list box. So to do this, I'm going to be sure to close out of our window here. I'm going to add a function at the top of our script here called add to list. So I'll just add that right up here. So we'll call this add to list, and it's not going to take in any arguments. So first, when we click this add button here, when we click this button here, what we're going to want to do is grab the text of this text entry. So to do that, we can say entry.get. And we're going to want to set that equal to a variable so that we have that saved. And now, before we add the text value to the list, let's make sure something was actually typed in. We don't want it to add a bunch of blank lines if someone clicks the button multiple times. So below here, I can simply say if text. And if there was text, then we can add that to the end of our current list. So to do this, we can say text list. And text list is down here. It's what we called our list box. We can say text list.insert. And now we're going to use a special Tkinter constant that represents the end of the current content in a widget. And that is tk.end. And then we can add in that text. So again, basically all we're saying here is when we run this add to list function, we are getting the text that is in that entry. If there is text there and it's not just a blank line, then we can say text.insert, insert at the end of the content of that widget. And what we want to insert is that text. And lastly, in forms like this, usually when they are submitted, then it erases the original input from the field so that the user can continue entering additional values without manually clearing the form themselves. So to do this, we can simply just say entry dot delete, and we want to delete this from the beginning all the way to the end. And again, we're going to use this tk.end as that special constant. Okay, so this is all the functionality that we want for when we click our button. But remember, we need to tell our script to run this function when the button is clicked. We saw this earlier, and we can do this just by passing in this function as an argument to the command parameter. So down here where we are creating our button, I'm going to say that the command, I'm going to say that the command is equal to, and we want it to be equal to this add list function. And again, make sure that this function isn't executed. We're just passing in the function name. Okay, so let's see if we have the functionality that we're looking for. I'll save this and run it. And now let's test this out. I'll say this, click add, is add a test. And we can see that each time it added a new element to our list view here, and each time it also cleared out everything that we had in that text input area there. Okay, so now another common thing that we might see in an application like this is keyboard events. So we might want to make it so that the user can simply hit the enter key to add that text to our list instead of needing to manually click that button. So to do this, we can use the bind method on our entry widget. And this will show us something about event handling that we haven't seen yet. So let's go ahead and take a look. So right below where we added our entry to our frame, now I'm going to bind this entry, and I'm going to bind this to a keyboard event. And the first argument that we're going to add here is going to be the type of event that we want to act upon. So for example, we could be listening for button clicks, a specific key pressed, and things like that. In this case, we want to handle when the return key is pressed. And the syntax for that is simply, within these brackets here, return. And now that we have this return binded to an event, now we need to specify what we want to happen when that event takes place. Now we already have a function that we've written for this, but there is a caveat here. These bound events will automatically pass an event object as an argument to our callback function, but our current function does not take any arguments. So if we just pass that in as is, then we're going to get an error. So let me go ahead and do this really quick. So I'll pass that in, and let me quickly show you what this looks like. If I run this, then we can see everything works so far. But if I add this in and hit enter, then we're going to see here that we have an error because it passed an event argument to our function that does not currently take any arguments. So there are a couple of different ways that we can handle this. First, we could simply change our function to accept an optional event object. To do that, we could just simply say event is equal to none by default, and that would work. Now, another thing that you'll see a lot of people using are lambda functions for these callbacks. A lambda function is an anonymous function that doesn't have a name and is usually used for very short one-line functions. So if I were to use a lambda function, then the syntax for this would be lambda, and then the arguments that it's going to accept. So I'll accept that event. And now what we want to happen when this anonymous function is ran. What we want to happen is we want to call this add to list function. So that's another way you might see people do it. But I think it looks better the other way that we had it. So I'm going to go ahead and put that back to the way it was. So now if I save this and run it, now in our application here, we should have this keyboard functionality working. So you can see I'm not clicking on the button. So I'm just saying this is a test, a little out of order from how I typed it in, but that's okay. So there we go. It says that all that is working. So I'm going to go ahead and close that down. Okay, so now that we've looked at handling different events and how to have different widgets interact with each other, let's now take a look at some ways we can clean up our layout and make our applications look a bit better. So first, our application currently doesn't respond in any way when the window is resized, and different elements aren't really lining up with each other within the window. And this is because by default, things that are added only take up the space that they need, and that's it. So let's make this look a little better by having these widgets line up properly and also resize accordingly with our window. So first, if we look at our text entry area here, or sorry, not our text entry, but our text list, we can see that it only takes up one column, which looks a little weird. And that's because we have both the entry and the button widgets in the first row, but only this one widget in the second row. So to make this look better, I'm going to tell this widget that it should expand 2 columns since there's only one element in this second row, and that it should take up both of these columns. So to do that, I'm going to close down our window, and down here where we have are adding this using our grid, I'm just going to say column span is equal to 2. And now if I save this and run it, then it should take up 2 columns. But we can see that it's still a little strange here because now it's taking up 2 columns, but it's centering it within those 2 columns. So in order to get these widgets to take up the available space, we can tell the widget to stick to certain sides of the window. So to do this, I'm going to close that down. Here, I'm going to say sticky, and for sticky, I'm going to pass in EW, and that stands for east and west. So since we wanted this to stick to the sides, the left and the right sides, we're going to use east and west here. So now if I save this and run it, then we can see that this looks a lot better. It's now taking up all of the width that it needs to take up, but it's still not responsive if we resize our window here. So we can fix that next. So in order to get this to be responsive, we're going to need to configure the rows and columns of our root window and our frame. So to do this, above the frame here, let's go ahead and configure our row columns and our rows. I'm sorry, our root columns and our root rows. So what I'm going to say here is column configure, and this is going to be for the first column, so an index of 0. And I'm going to set an weight equal to 1. And I'm going to do the same thing for the row here as well. So instead of column configure, I'm going to have this be row configure. And I'll have this be the first row, weight equal to 1. So having the first row and column with a weight equal to 1, this makes it take up all the available space when it's resized. And we'll look at different weights in just a bit. But for now, let's also configure our frame. Now, since our root window is able to expand, we should now tell our frame to stick to all sides of that window when it's expanded. So we're going to use that sticky parameter again, but instead of just horizontal with east and west, we want it to also be vertical with north and south so that it grows on all sides. So frame here, we're going to set the sticky here, and we're going to have this be north, south, east, and west. And now we're just about done here. What we want to do now is we want our frame to be able to expand as well. So we have to configure those rows and columns just like we did with our root window. But remember, our frame has 2 rows of widgets and 2 columns. We don't want all of these to expand evenly. So for example, it would look weird if our button expanded to be really big. So our text entry and our list box are both in that first row. So let's allow those to expand only horizontally. So I'll say frame dot column configure, and I'll set the first column here with a weight equal to 1. So again, our text entry is in that first column. Our button is in the second column, and our text list is in that first column. So the first column is going to be able to expand, and the second column is not. So let me go ahead and run this now. And if I resize this, then we can see that this text input here is expanding to take up the additional space. It's not sticking to the sides yet. Our button is not expanding, and our list box here is expanding horizontally for now. So let me close that. So first, let's fix our list box so that it's growing vertically north and south as well. So to do this, I'll say frame, and we will do a row configure, and that text list is in the second row, which is index of 1. And now, instead of just expanding east and west, let's also do north and south here as well. And for our entry here, it was expanding to take up the space, but it wasn't sticking to the sides. So let's also set a sticky here. And we only want this to grow east and west. We don't want it to grow vertically. So now if we run this, then let's take a look at what we did here. So we can see that when we expand now, that our text list is growing north, south, east, and west, and our text input entry here is only growing east and west, and our button is staying there to the side. So everything is growing just as we specified, and I think that that looks a lot better than it did before. So now let me go ahead and close this out. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at one more thing before we finish up. So just to show why using a frame is beneficial, let's say that everything that we have currently is something that we would like replicated in different parts of our application or even in a new project. Since we added this to a frame, it makes it easier to organize and reuse this set of widgets. So for a contrived example, let's just say that we wanted 2 different forms like this in our application that span 2 different columns in the main window. So to do this, let's make a copy and paste what we had before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this frame and all of the widgets that we have included here, and I will paste these down below here. And now this frame, instead of just calling it frame, I'm going to call this frame 2. So I'm going to grab all of these here, and I will rename these to frame 2. And I'm just going to leave these the same. I should probably change those, but really I just want to show the layout and kind of ignore the functionality for now. So now we have this frame 2. And we're creating a new entry and adding that to frame 2, a new button, adding that to frame 2, and a new text list and adding that to frame 2 as well. So now that we've added this second frame, since this frame has its own rows and columns, we don't need to change anything about the layout of the widgets within the frame. If we didn't have this in a frame and we wanted to add more widgets, then we would have to come up here and say, you know, okay, well, this entry is in row 1, column 1, so I want this one to be in row 1, column 2, and we'd have to do all this math that we just don't have to do now that we have this in a separate frame. The only thing that we should need to do is specify where we want this new frame to be added. So our old frame is up here on row 0, column 0, and our new frame, I'll just have this be in the second column, so index of 1. Now, if I run this how we have it now, then we can see that now we have 2 identical forms, one in the first column, one in the second column. Now, if I resize this, then we can see that these don't take up the same width when we resize. Now, this is because of how we set up the weights earlier. So let's change these to see exactly how these weights work. So let me go back up here to the top where we set the weights on our root window. So the reason our first column expands is because we set the column with a weight of 1. The second column doesn't have a weight by default, so it only takes up the space that it needs and nothing more. But if we wanted this to take up the same space as our other column, then we could set this to 1 also by saying root column configure, and we can set that column with a weight as 1 as well. So now if I save this and run it, then these should take up equal sizes on the left and the right, since both of these columns are weighted the same. So Let me close this out. So these weights are proportional to the weights of the other columns. So for example, let's say that the column on the left is meant to be more of a sidebar, but we wanted to expand a little bit, but not at the same rate as the column on the right. So for that, I could set the weight of the right column to be, let's set it to 3. And then it would take up 75% of that additional space than the column on the left. So if I run this, then we can see that now the column on the right has a much larger weight. Now you might notice that this doesn't look like it takes up 75% of the window, and that's because it's taking up 75% of the additional space in this example. So their original sizes don't factor into that size, but this is a nice way to get our windows to expand relative to the importance of what we're trying to highlight most within our GUI application. So let me close that down. Now, another extremely common thing that we might want to do for the layout is adding padding to our elements, and this is super simple. Let's add padding to both of our frames to give it a bit more space between the edges of the main window. So to do this, on frame 1 here, where we're adding it to our grid, I'm simply going to add in a pad X equal to 5, and I'll add a pad Y equal to 5 as well, and we will put this onto our frame 2 also. So let me go ahead and paste that in. And now if I run this, then we can see that we have a little bit of padding here between our main windows. So it kind of gives a little bit of a visual separation. Okay, and really quick, before we finish this tutorial, I want to show you a couple more tricks for helping our applications look better among different platforms. So one of those tips is to use themed widgets when they're available. These are updated widgets that give a more native look across different platforms, but not every widget has a themed version. So for example, in the code that we have here, the only widget that we're using that doesn't have a themed counterpart is the list box widget. But let's use themed widgets on one of our frames to see if we can see a visual difference. So to do this, I'm going to import TTK, which stands for themed Tkinter, and this is also built into Python. So here at the top, I'm going to say from Tkinter, import TTK. And now let's use this on our first frame where it's applicable. So instead of TK here for our frame, I'm going to say TTK.frame. So hardly any changes are made. All we're doing is using theme Tkinter instead of the built-in one. So I'm going to use this for our frame, our entry button as well. And remember, I said that this list box does not have a themed version. So I'm only going to change those 3. So if I save that and run it, then we can see that this doesn't look much different, but these buttons should now look and behave more natively to the environment that we're on. So we can see I'm on a Mac, so we can see that the button here on our left frame is a bit different than the button here on the right. And so is our text input. It looks a little different as well. I think they might even have different interactions for how they look when you click on them and things like that. We can see that this one, it's a little bit more obvious than what it is over here. So what theme Tkinter is trying to do here is just make this look a bit more native to the Mac that I'm currently running on. So that's just a quick way to make our applications look a bit better across different platforms. Okay, so what we've learned here so far should be enough of the basics to get you up and running with building your own GUI applications, but there's still a lot that we haven't covered. So in future tutorials, we'll take a look at more topics that we haven't touched here. So we'll learn how to create these using classes, how to have multiple windows, adding images, saving and opening files, adding animations, showing or removing widgets based on a condition, and things like that. There's a lot more that we can cover. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'll also show you how I built some of my personal GUI apps that I use on a regular basis, like the credit card transaction one that I showed. Also, I built another one for game nights that simulates rolling dice and tracks the rolls. I also have a GUI application that I wrote for my father that reads in Excel files and uses Google Maps API to analyze specific coordinates from different columns and then resaves those Excel files with that analyzed data. So things like that are really good for GUI applications, and you can pass those off to people who might not necessarily know how to run Python, but will know how to run your GUI application. So be on the lookout for those videos in the future, but these fundamentals that we learned here should be enough to get you started with your own applications and experimenting with different widgets and layouts in order to solve particular problems that you might have. Also in the future, I would like to take all of the Tkinter content and show how we can create these exact same applications using other GUI frameworks like PyQt and Kivy. So be sure you're subscribed to keep up with those future releases. But with that said, I think that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully now you have a pretty good idea for how you can create some simple applications using Tkinter and how we can lay out our widgets and get them to interact with one another. But if anyone has any questions about what we covered in this video, then feel free to ask in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer those. And if you enjoy these tutorials and would like to support them, then there are several ways you can do that. The easiest way is to simply like the video and give it a thumbs up. Also, it's a huge help to share these videos with anyone who you think would find them useful. And if you have the means, you can contribute through Patreon or YouTube, and there are links to those pages in the description section below. Be sure to subscribe for future videos, and thank you all for watching.